There are certain nutrients that when you don't have them in your diet, you're going to feel it immediately. It could be like brain fog, or maybe you just don't have the energy. So today we're going to go through 6 nutrients approved by doctors that you should never skip. The first nutrient is choline. And if you don't get enough of this nutrient, you can develop a condition called choline deficiency syndrome. And so what are the symptoms? What does it look like? Well, it looks like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So that means that your liver now has fat in it. It also can cause elevated levels of triglycerides in the blood. This can lead to insulin resistance, where your body now cannot use insulin properly to take the sugar out of the blood. So then that leads to other conditions like diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease. And it also can cause something called duty dysfunction, where basically your bile ducts that drain the gallbladder into the small intestine become blocked. So now you can't digest fats properly. That can also lead to diarrhea, weight loss, and even osteoporosis. Now, the richest source of choline in food comes from egg yolks. So this is why they say do uneat the egg white, because the egg yolk contains all these nutrients, especially choline. And the second highest source of food that has choline is beef. Okay, so those are the 2 highest sources. But you can also get some decent amounts of choline in chicken, salmon, cauliflower, and broccoli. Now, what about supplements of choline? Yes, there's many different types of supplements of choline. For example, CDP choline, beta-tartrate, citicholine, choline, alpha-cerat. But a lot of times people take this for the cognitive benefits for the brain. Then you have a supplement called alpha-GPC, which is another type of choline supplement, and people take this for the heart and for exercise. And then finally you have a supplement called tremelisine. This is a combination of phosphatidylcholine and beta-tene anhydrous. Now before we get to the next nutrient, I want to make sure that you guys understand this really important concept. When it comes to food, it's always best to get your nutrients from the food. So getting nutrients from the food is way better than taking supplements, but sometimes you might not be able to get enough from the food, right? Maybe your diet is lacking in certain nutrients, or maybe you're not absorbing the nutrients from the food because you have digestive issues. Or maybe you have an increased demand for certain nutrients because you re-pregnant or breastfeeding, or maybe you re-exercising a lot, or maybe you have a medical condition where you're re-losing certain nutrients, in which case you might need to supplement. All right, the second nutrient that you should never skip is potassium. If you don't get enough potassium in your diet, you're going to have a lot of issues. Like I said, you're going to feel it. Here are some of the things that can happen. You can develop high blood pressure because potassium helps lower blood pressure. You can develop something called hyperglycemia, which is high blood sugar. In fact, if you have low potassium levels, it makes insulin resistance worse. Also, if you're low in potassium, you're going to have muscle weakness, and you're going to have cramps. And the last thing is you're going to have more inflammation. Now, what foods are high in potassium? Well, the highest source is avocado, okay? And then the second highest is spinach. Other foods that are high in potassium include squash, tomatoes, broccoli, beet tops, Swiss chard, and of course bananas. But it's interesting because when people talk about bananas and potassium, they always talk about the yellow bananas. But the truth is, the best bananas for potassium are the green bananas. In fact, when the banana ripens, it loses its potassium. It loses about 30% of its potassium every day until it becomes a ripe yellow banana. So if you have the choice between green bananas or yellow bananas, definitely go with the green bananas because they have more potassium. Now what about potassium citrate versus potassium gluconate? What's the difference? Well, potassium citrate, which is one of the most common forms of potassium supplements, has a very high absorption rate. And so some people wonder, well, if it's absorbed so fast, doesn't that mean that it will quickly leave my body? And the answer is yes, it does. That's actually a good thing because you don't want potassium building up inside the cells. You want to be able to control the amount of potassium that's inside the cell. Potassium gluconate, on the other hand, has a very slow absorption rate, which means that you won't get the results as fast, but it also stays in the body longer. And that SYAS usually recommended for people that have chronic kidney disease, and they need to prevent losing too much potassium through their urine. All right, number 3, we have zinc. And if you don't get enough zinc, you can develop something called hypogonadism, which is low testosterone. So men, if you're low in zinc, you may notice a decrease in libido, lower sexual drive, lower fertility, and you may even develop enlarged prostate. Also, zinc is needed for normal wound healing, normal immune function, and healthy skin. The richest source of zinc comes from oysters, so if you don't eat oysters, you may be at risk for a zinc deficiency. The second highest source of zinc comes from red meat, and then we have poultry, fish, and nuts. Now, if you're considering taking a zinc supplement, there are different types of zinc supplements, but the main ones are zinc citrate, which is very absorbable. And then we have zinc gluconate, which is less absorbable, but it stays in the body longer. All right, no. 4 is magnesium. If you don't get enough magnesium, you can develop low magnesium syndrome, and here are some of the symptoms. You can develop muscle cramps and even seizures. You can develop hypertension, high blood pressure. You can develop cardiac arrhythmias, which is basically a problem with your heartbeat. You can develop type 2 diabetes. You can develop osteoporosis, and you can have more inflammation. Now, the richest source of magnesium comes from pumpkin seeds. And so I recommend having like a tablespoon of pumpkin seeds, which gives you 80% of your daily requirement for magnesium. Other foods that are high in magnesium include chia seeds, cashews, almonds, spinach, avocados, and of course, dark chocolate. Now, when it comes to magnesium supplements, there are several different forms of magnesium supplements, and each one has its own advantages and disadvantages. So for example, you have magnesium glycinate, which is highly absorbable, but it's more expensive. And then you have magnesium oxide, which is less absorbable, but it's cheaper, and so it depends on what you want to do. But here are some of the most common forms of magnesium supplements: magnesium citrate, magnesium diglycinate, magnesium aspartate, magnesium sulfate. It's also known as Epsom salt, which you can use for a bath or even drink it. And then magnesium chloride, which you can find in a topical lotion. And then magnesium taurate, which is good for the heart. And then magnesium L-threonate, which is good for the brain. All right, no. 5 is vitamin D. If you don't get enough vitamin D, you can develop bone pain, muscle pain, and even depression. In fact, there are many studies showing that low levels of vitamin D can lead to depression. You can also develop bone loss, osteoporosis, and you can have a weaker immune system. Now, the best way to get vitamin D is from the sun. Just 10 minutes of sun exposure can give you 10,000 IUs of vitamin. But you have to be careful not to get too much because you can develop something called vitamin D toxicity. So how do you know how long you should be exposed to the sun? Well, it depends on your skin pigmentation. It depends on the time of day. It depends on the season. It depends on your latitude. It depends on how much cloud cover there is. And it's very complicated. But I found a great little device that actually measures how much sun exposure you need based on your individual circumstances. And I put a link down below. It's called the Solido. It's very cool. So check it out. Put a link down below. When it comes to vitamin D supplements, most doctors recommend at least 10,000 IUs per day. But the key thing to realize is that vitamin D is a hormone. And so you want to periodically check your vitamin D levels, especially when you're first starting out, because you don't want to overshoot it. And if you get too much vitamin D, it can be toxic. In fact, here are some of the symptoms of vitamin D toxicity. You can develop fatigue, weakness, bone pain, joint pain, insomnia, constipation, elevated cholesterol, and elevated blood pressure. Finally, number 6 is vitamin K1. And the symptom of a vitamin K1 deficiency is easy to remember. It's bleeding. So you can develop excessive bleeding because vitamin K1 is needed for normal blood clotting. In fact, vitamin K1 activates several different proteins that are needed for the clotting process. Now, the good news is that vitamin K1 is relatively stable, so it's not easily destroyed by cooking. And the richest source of vitamin K1 comes from cabbage, followed by kale, spinach, and broccoli. Now, since we're talking about vitamin K, let's talk about vitamin K2. Vitamin K2 works together with vitamin K1. And so when you take vitamin K1, you also need to take vitamin K2. And the symptom of a vitamin K2 deficiency is the opposite of a vitamin K1 deficiency. And that is clotting too much, developing clots. So you can develop heart disease, you can develop stroke, you can develop pulmonary hypertension. But vitamin K2 is also needed for many other things, including mitochondrial health, protecting your arteries from calcification, protecting your bones from calcification, normal brain development, and preventing tooth decay. The richest source of vitamin K2 comes from cheese, followed by butter, followed by meat, and then eggs. So if you're enjoying my content, which I hope you are, and you're applying this knowledge to your health and you have a success, I would really appreciate you sharing your success story. So share your success story to help inspire others.